Oh, here we're on the way to April 1st. It'd be a miracle if I can get this shit all uploaded before turn of the century here. The last one for the evening. We're here at Tailgate in Heaven, Charizard Cross. Read by Bradley Dahlberg in 2024. Chapter 13. The Richard Nixon Library. Olympia, Washington, November 1990 through May 1991. It might be the time for the Betty Ford Clinic or the Richard Nixon Library to save me from abusing my anemic rodent-like body any longer. From a letter to Toby Vale, May 1991. Heroin. Kurt's own bastardization of the word heroin had first appeared back in his rude cartoons in 8th grade. Having grown up fascinated by rock and roll, he was well aware of the many musicians he idolized had succumbed to drug abuse. And though he addictively smoked pot and frequently drank too much and was known to huff inhalant from the bottom of shaving cream cans, he pledged that he would never suffer a similar fate. In 1987, during one of Kurt's sober periods, he chastised Jesse Reed when his friend suggested they try heroin. Kurt wouldn't hang out with me after that, Jesse remembered. I was trying to find heroin, a drug I had never tried, and he'd never tried, and he would lecture me. Why do you want to kill yourself? Why do you want to die so badly? In a personal drug history constructed later in his life, Kurt wrote that he first tried heroin in Aberdeen in the late 80s. His friends contest this since he had a fear of needles at the time and there was no heroin to be found in the circle. He did occasionally take Percodan in Aberdeen, a prescription narcotic. He may have romanticized and exaggerated this opiate when recalling it later. By fall of 1990, a broken-hearted over Toby and the same questions Kurt asked Jesse later could have been put to him. In early November, he overcame his fear of needles and his first injected heroin with his friend at Olympia. He found the drug's euphoric effects helped him temporarily escape his heartache from his stomach pain. The next day, Kurt phoned Chris and said, "Hey, I did heroin." Kurt told his friend. "Well, what was that like?" Chris asked. Kurt said, "Oh, it was alright." Chris then told him, "You shouldn't do it. Look at Andy Wood." Wood was the lead singer of Mother Love Bone, an up-and-coming Seattle band who died of a heroin overdose in March 1990. And Novoselic cited that Olympia friends who had died of heroin addiction. Kurt's reply was, "Yeah, I know Novoselic," playing the role of older brother, warned Kurt that heroin wasn't like other drugs he had done. I remembered literally telling him that he was playing with dynamite. But the warning fell on deaf ears, and though Kurt promised Chris that he wasn't going to try the drug again, he broke that promise to avoid Chris and Grohl's finding out. Kurt used the drug at a friend's house, and he found a dealer named Jose, who was selling to many of the greeners in Olympia, and coincidentally, Dylan Carlson had experimented with heroin for the first time that fall, and though not with Kurt. But soon their bonding extended to heroin, and usually done only once a week, owing to several factors, including their poverty and their desire to not become addicts. They would go on occasional binges, like the time they rented a cheap hotel in Seattle to nod off in privacy, without alarming their friends and roommates. But Kurt's friends were alarmed by his drug use. Tracy had finally forgiven Kurt, and they were occasionally hanging out. When Shelley told her that Kurt was doing heroin, she couldn't believe her ears. And that week, Kurt phoned Tracy that night, obviously high, and she challenged him directly. He told me he'd done it a few times, and he said that he really liked it, and that it made him more sociable, and that he wasn't going to do it all the time. I tried to walk that fine line by telling him that he shouldn't do it without making him feel bad for having done it. A week later, they had spent an evening together, attending several parties, and between events, Kurt insisted that they stop by his place so he could use the toilet, and when he didn't return, Tracy went looking and found him on the floor with a bottle of bleach sitting next to him and a needle in his arm. She was furious. Kurt had turned into something that Tracy couldn't. Having imagined her own worst nightmare, the joke of Nirvana's first album title no longer seemed funny to anyone, but heroin was only a small part of 1990 for Kurt, and most of the part that he had kept his promise to use it only occasionally. He distracted from all else in the fact that his career was taking off like never before, and he had signed a contract in the fall of Virginia Publishing, which brought him his first big check. Kaz Utznam Samnimnia, president of Virginia, flew to the Northwest to ink a deal, and though Kaz was a longtime industry veteran, having worked with everyone from Clash to Queen, he was shocked to see the squalor of Kurt's apartment, and they talked about Kurt's influences, particularly the Clash. Kurt said Sandinista was one of the first records he owned that was remotely punk. Kurt's initial share of the publishing deal came in the form of a check of $3,000. He paid his rent and then drove to the South Sound Mall with Mikey Nelson and Joe Preston, and Kurt spent almost $1,000 in Toys R Us. On the US Nintendo system, 2-pixel video cameras, 2 automatic BB guns. Oh shit. 2 automatic BB guns to look like M16 rifles, several Evel Knievel plastic models. He also bought fake dog feces, fake vomit, rubber severed heads. He threw it all in a basket, remembered Preston. It was just a bunch of junk that he could destroy. It was as if an 8-year-old boy had been sent loose on the store and he could have anything he wanted. Kurt used a BB gun immediately to shoot out the windows of the Washington State Lottery building across the street. He also bought for $20 a used child's swinger bicycle, a style that at the time had been remarkably unhip. It was so tiny, and pedaling it required him to scrunch over with his knees to his shoulders. Kurt gleefully rode the bike until it was dark. He was still riding the bike a few days later in the midst of what at the time was the most important business meeting he'd ever had. On Thurston Moore's recommendations, the band contacted Gold Mountain Management, and the firm was run by Danny Goldberg, John Silva, and Silva was the younger manager who was assigned to the job of negotiating with Nirvana. It was an easy task because the connectedness of Sonic's youth had already had Kurt's stamp of approval. Silva and his girlfriend Leah Facker, came to Seattle to meet the band, to meet face-to-face and take them into dinner. Kurt loved being taken to dinner by music industry honchos because it was the only time that he could guarantee eating a decent meal. But this night, Silva and the rest of the band sat around for hours while Kurt rode the swinger bike in a circle at the lottery parking lot. We all decided he was going to break a limb, recalled Facker, and though the long day seemed like it was just another childish pastime, a more cynical observer made it more suggestive if Kurt's first move would have been become the battle of wills with his soon-to-be manager. Kurt put on his bicycle down to go to dinner, but afterwards announced the Beat Happening was playing across town, and it was a test of Silva's interest, like any good businessman, and Silva acted enthused and went to the show with Kurt. Silva protested to Facker later that he detested the Calvin's band. She also remembered he initially hated Sonic Youth, complaining about their major egos, and yet he passed Kurt's acid test, and within a week Nirvana had signed with Gold Mountain. On November 25th, Nirvana played a show at Seattle's Off-Ramp. That's my motherfucking birthday. How fucking cool is that? On November 25th, my birthday, Nirvana plays a show at Seattle's Off-Ramp to a more attracted AR representatives than any concert in the Northwest history. Representatives from Columbia Capitol Records / RCA, several of the labels were bumping into each other, and the AR guys were all in full court press, observed Sandy's Damian Stewart. The sheer number of AR reps altered the way the band was perceived in Seattle. By that time, explained Susan Silver, there was a competitive feeding and frenzy going on around them. The showing itself was remarkable, and Kurt later told himself it was his favorite Nirvana performance. During an 18-song set, the band played 12 unreleased songs, and they opened with a powerful aneurysm. The first time it was played public, and the crowd slammed, danced, and body surfed as they broke the light bulbs on the ceiling. I thought the show was amazing, recalled Kim Thale of Soundgarden. They did a cover of the Velvet Underground's Here She Comes Now, and I thought that it was brilliant. And then when I heard Lithium, it stuck in my mind. Ben, our bass player, came up to me and said, that's the hit. That's the top 40 hit right there. The AR men were so impressed. As the set ended, after the break for the fire alarm, Jeff Fenster of the Charismatic Records managed to convince the band his label was the best choice. 2 days later, Nirvana's lawyers, Alan Mintz, called and said the band was going to sign with Charisma. The deal was $200,000, a healthy but not outrageous advance, but Fenster could have the contract prepared, and the band could decide at the last minute to sign the deal with DGC, an imprint of Geffen Records. Though DGC's AR rep guy Gary Gersh had not been at one of the early bidders, the endorsement of Sonic Youth ultimately proved to be the deciding factor. Geffen had also a strong promotion department headed by Mark Cates, and Gold Mountain knew the promotion would be the key of breaking the band. The Geffen deal called for Nirvana to be paid $287,000, at the time one of the largest advances of the Northwest band. Mintz extricated the band from the vestiges of their Sub Pop contract and part of the Geffen agreement. Sub Pop would be paid $75,000, 2% of the sales for the next 2 albums. And though Kurt had read music industry books, Even though he wasn't prepared for how long the deal would take to be finalized, the contract wasn't signed until April. This is little, and here we are in April, on April 1st. How little money initially meant for him. By the time the fees of the lawyers and the manager, the taxes, the debts deducted, Gold Mountain put him on a retainer of $1,000 per month. He immediately got behind on all his bills, and complained that he could only afford corn dogs, and the floor in his apartment was now littered with their sticks. Grohl had gone back east for most of December, and minus his roommate, Kurt sought to relieve his boredom by any means necessary. He hung out a lot with Dylan and soon broke another barrier he'd sworn never to cross. Dylan was a gun nut, and Kurt constantly preached that guns were barbaric. A few times Kurt agreed to go into the woods with Dylan, and he wanted to touch guns, and on one occasion refused to leave the car, but eventually Kurt began to let Dylan show him to aim and fire. It was a harmless stuff, putting holes in cans with shotguns and shooting up projects that Kurt had decided to sacrifice. Kurt had also begun to hang out with Mikey Nelson at a shop in thrift stores, and there was also some record he was hoping to track down, said Nelson. One of his favorites had a bunch of truckers talking on the CV radio. He had Charles Manson record, Lie, and he was a big fan of the H.R. Puffin stuff. Even in 1990, Kurt was still pushing the merits of the knack, get the knack. He told me all the great songs on the record were the people that I hadn't heard of. John Perky had stopped by the apartment that one month and helped Kurt shop for his Christmas presents. Kurt's biggest purchase that year was a large custom aquarium for his turtles. They smoked marijuana before shopping. But Perky surprised Kurt when he says, "Do you know where I can get some heroin?" Perky replied, "You're not shooting up, are you?" "Oh no," Kurt lied. "I'll just smoke anything." In many ways, his meager budget helped curb his addictive desires, and he simply couldn't afford to become a drug addict. On December 11th, Kurt again sought out medical help for his stomach condition, seeing a doctor in Tacoma. This time the diagnosis was irritable bowel syndrome, and Kurt was prescribed Lidox, a form of clinodium. The drug didn't help his pain, and he discontinued it 2 weeks later after his bronchitis didn't get better. The year ended with the New Year's Eve show in Portland, and its Satrion Slim traveled down with the band and remembered that the knockout show, despite the fact that Kurt was drunk on whiskey and coke, and against his doctor's orders, it was now noticeable that Kurt was attracting groupies. Slim watched one young woman locking eyes with him for the whole show. Her demeanor said, "I'm the girl in the audience who wants to fuck you tonight." Kurt, however, didn't notice, and like most nights, he went home alone. They began 1991 with the 3-hour late-night drive from Portland, since they had a studio session scheduled the next day. They finished 2 songs with Aneurysm re-recording Even in His Use, and they also worked up several songs that Kurt had just written, including an early All Apologies. They had a bunch of ideas and wanted to throw down and remember Craig Montgomery, who produced the tracks. But their gear was in horrible shape, and they were pretty fried. Kurt's friend Jesse Reed remembered the Northwest Holiday that day and recording session when in Aberdeen to visit Jesse's parents on the drive. Kurt found himself talking about the future with his old friend, and as the car entered Grays Harbor, the country admitted his love for the landscape and the people, contradicting all the said in reviews. As they passed down the farms of the old sad-top idyllic valley, despite the abandoned nuclear plant, Kurt told Jesse his dream was to use this label to advance to buy a farm. He saw a large ranch house and pointed to it. "What do you think of the house over there? If I buy it, then I could play as loud as we want, have big parties, and have people over, and no one will care." The house wasn't for sale, and Kurt had no money yet. But he swore to Jesse that if he ever did hit it the big time, he'd come back to the harbor and buy a ranch, just like Neil Young has in California. Early in 1991, Kurt made a telephone call, and he'd been putting off for years, and he phoned his father. Since the moving to Olympia, most of his contact with Don had been through his grandparents, and the conversation was as typical as the communication had been between the two chaotic Cobain men was short. Kurt mostly talked about the band, telling Don that he had signed a major label, and Don wasn't sure what that meant. When he asked Kurt if he had enough money, and his son said yes. Kurt inquired of Don's other children. They had briefly chatted about Don's latest job, working with an investor at the Washington State Patrol. Kurt told his father that he'd been following a lot, and Don said that he'd enjoy seeing him sometime. The conversation lasted only a few minutes and was remarkable for the first time the two men didn't say more than what they did. Don wasn't able to talk about the hurt that he felt that his firstborn had drifted away, and Kurt wasn't able to talk about any of the hurt that he felt, not the divorce, the remarriage, or the many other struggles. Kurt had stayed better in touch with his mother, and the interest of his career and her acceptance of him as a musician seemed to increase as his fame did. Kurt and Wendy drew closer yet year when another family tragedy struck. On January 2nd, 1991, Wendy's brother Patrick died of AIDS in California at 46. Patrick's homosexuality had always been a deep secret within the Friedenberg family. He was so good-looking and popular with the girls, and his parents seemed unable to believe it, and suffered from clinical depression. But when he developed full-blown AIDS, it sent him into an emotional tailspin. His anger at his parents was so great that he had planned to write a treatise of his lifelong sexual history. A treatise? Write a treatise of his lifelong sexual history, which included that he had been sexually abused by his uncle Delbert, and send it to the Aberdeen Daily World to embarrass the family, as it was the family that decided to leave the cause of death of his obituary and list a domestic partner as a special friend. Kurt was invited to the memorial ceremony, but he didn't attend, citing his need to work as an upcoming album. For once, Kurt wasn't lying to get out of the family commitment. He was indeed preparing for his album in 1991, began fastidiously working. Nirvana had rented a new practice space in Tacoma, and every day rehearsed hours for some of their playing was now to teach Grohl their new songs at the catalog, but much of the homecoming new material was writing. In January, Sub Pop released their latest official single, a live recording of the Vaseline's Molly's Lips. In the Run of the Groove mill, the label had etched onto the word farewell later. In February, Kurt turned 24. On that occasion, he sat down and began to write the story of his life and one of the dozen short attempts he undertook over the years. The version ran 3 pages, petering out, "Hi, I'm 24 years old," he wrote. "I was born a white lower-class middle male off the Washington West Coast state. My parents owned a compact stereo component system modeled in a simulated wood grain in a 4-record box set featuring the AM radio's contemporary hits of Tony Orlando and Don Marie's Tie Yellow Ribbon, Jim Croce's Time in a Bottle, and after the years of my begging, they finally bought me a tin drum set with paper heads out of the back of the Sears catalog. Within the first week, my sister poked holes in the heads with the screwdriver." Kurt's history went on to note that he remembered his mother playing in Chicago songs on the piano, and that he'd forever be grateful to his Aunt Marie for giving him the Beatles albums. He wrote that one of his first disappointments was when he found out in 1976 that the Beatles had dissolved 6 years earlier. His parents' divorce seemed to have less of an effect. "My parents got divorced, so I moved on with my dad in the trailer park and got into an even smaller logging community. My dad's friends talked into joining the Columbia Records Club, and soon records started to show up at the trailer once a week and accumulating a quite large record collection. And with that, and this attempt at telling my life ended." He went back to his favorite journal on the subject at the time, writing literary notes for the upcoming album, and he wrote many fine different versions. The album ultimately didn't include any of the one-draft dedication, for the record said more of the childhood of his attempted biography. "Thanks to the unencouraging parents everywhere," he wrote, "forgiving their child, they will show up them." In March, Nirvana played a 4-date Canadian tour and then immediately went back into rehearsal, and after much debate, their managers and label bosses, they settled on Butch Vig as the producer, using a Sound City, a studio of Los Angeles. The label would be picking up the expenses, and though they would come to Nirvana's advance before they headed back for California, the band had one more in Seattle show, April 17th at the OK Hotel, and Kurt organized it, hearing after her friend Mikey Nelson had so many unpaid traffic citations. He was in danger of going to jail. The lineup included Bikini Kill, Fits of Depression, and Kurt insisted all the proceeds go to Nelson. The show did not completely sell out, owing the party to the movie singles of the same night. Nirvana's set included covers of Devo's Turnaround, The Trogs' Wild Thing, and The Wipers' D7. But the surprise came when the band played a new composition. Kurt slurred the vocals, perhaps not knowing all the words, and the guitar part was in place. The tremendous driving drum beat, "I didn't know what they were playing," recalled Susie Tennant, DGC promotion rep, "but I knew it was amazing. I remember jumping up and down and asking everyone what the song was." The tenets of the word mimicked Novoselic and Grohl. Just 3 weeks earlier, Kurt brought the a new riff into rehearsal. "It's called Smells Like Teen Spirit," Kurt announced. Kurt announced it was bandmates stealing the Kathleen Hanna graffiti at the time. No one in the band knew about the deodorant, and it wasn't until the song got recorded and mastered that anyone pointed out the name of the product in it. When Kurt first brought the song into the studio, faster than the beat, less than the focus of the bridge, Kurt was playing just the chorus. Chris remembered it was Chris' idea to slow the tune down. Grohl instinctively added the powerful drum beat. At the OK Hotel, Kurt just hummed a couple of the verses. He was changing the lyrics to all of his songs during this period. Teen Spirit was about a dozen different drafts, and one of the first drafts featured the chorus, "A denial from strangers, a revival from favors. Here we are now. We're so famous. We're so stupid. From Vegas." Another began, "Come out and play, make up the rules, have lots of fun. We know we'll lose." Later in the same version had the same time of no rhyming couplet. "The finest day I've ever had was when tomorrow never came." A week later, the band headed to Los Angeles. On a drive down, Kurt stopped at Universal Studios and went the same rides he had taken with his grandparents 15 years before. The group moved into the Oakwood apartments for the next 6 weeks, and not far from the Sound City Studios, Vig visited them during the pre-production of The Found Chaos. There was graffiti on the walls, he remembered, and the couches were upside down. They would stay up every night and go down to the Venice Beach until 6 in the morning, and the nervousness the band felt about recording alleviated by the drinking. All three of these members did to excess. One night, Chris was arrested while driving intoxicated, and John Silva had to scramble to bail him out and get him back into the studio. Most of the sessions began at 3 in the afternoon and ran until midnight. During the breaks, Kurt wandered the halls of the studio and stared at the gold records for the albums like Fleetwood Mac's Rumors and Tom Petty's Damn the Torpedoes, though he was so most impressed by the Evel Knievel record cut there. The lit metal band Warrant had rented the studio before Nirvana. When the group came back to pick up the gear during the Nirvana sessions, Kurt grabbed the studio's paging system and started screaming, "Bring me some fucking cherry pie," the title of Warrant's hit. One night, Kurt stole the original master tapes to Evel Knievel's album and took them home to Olympia. They spent the first week trying to get the basic tracks down, mostly concentrating on the drum sound, which was Vig's specialty. After 2 weeks, they laid down 10 songs, and the most of them had no more than 3 weeks. Laid down 10 songs, though most had more than 3 takes, because Kurt's voice would wear out after so much screaming. Most of the songs were the ones they had previously cut during the Smart Studio sessions, and it was more technical work than creative. Compared to the other bands and the other sessions, there were few problems. During the recording of Lithium, Kurt struggled to get his guitar parts right, and became progressively more frustrated and eventually smashing his guitar on the studio floor. In the end, Vig decided to use the take and recorded during Kurt's meltdown. It was titled Endless Nameless, and put on the compact disc as a hidden track. The biggest problem of the session was Kurt's own procrastination. He still hadn't settled on lyrics for many of the songs, and though a few of the songs, like Polly and Breed, the band had been playing for years. When he did finish a lyric, the most paradoxical as a revelatory, many lines left the listener to unclear whether he was singing about the external or the internal circumstances, defying explanation, and though communications on an emotional tone. In his journals, Kurt wrote a letter of the long-dead critic, Lester Bangs, complaining about the state of rock journalism, a profession to be fascinated, and repulsed him by asking, "Why in the hell do journalists insist on coming up with a second-rate Freudian evaluation of my lyrics when 90% of the time they've transcribed them incorrectly?" And despite the wisdom in Kurt's question, he spent hours trying to figure out the songs of his idols. He labored over his own compositions, invariably inserting messages or editing himself when he thought that he was being too revealing. Such was the case in Something in the Way, the song recorded during the sessions. Kurt recounted the mythical period of Living Under the Bridge that he had written a song in yet an earlier time, but he had kept hidden from his bandmates. In his first imagining of the album, Kurt wanted to have a girl's side composed of all the songs about Toby, and a boy's side to include Sliver, Sappy, and Polly, among the others, and the songs about his family and his inner world. He had always planned to end the album with Something in the Way. Though he never mentioned this, his producer instead, he brought forth a song during the Sound City sessions as a last-minute surprise, and he wrote the lyrics down in the studio, making it appear as if we were all crafting them right on the spot, when he had worked them out for years. Despite the letter to Lester Bangs, and no single individual analyzed on the Freudian implications of his lyrics, Kurt himself, he knew very well that releasing a song implying that he lived under a bridge would cause much pain for his family. As they finished up the sessions, a friend of Grohl's visited and informed Tibet Kurt had to be on the cover of the Rolling Stone within the next 6 months, and Kurt replied, "Ah, forget it." Mikey Nelson and his bandmates from Fitz Depression also showed up and stayed with Nirvana at the Oakwood, as did the Melvins. During the weekend, there, the 22 people sleeping in their two-bedroom apartment, the Fitz had more bad luck. A club promised a much-needed show to be canceled at the last minute and call them back. Kurt insisted to tell him we'll play too. 2 days after finishing their record, Nirvana played a tiny Los Angeles club called the Jabberjaw, debuted on a plane and Come As You Are in front of an astonished audience. They insisted that all at the door money must go to Nelson. Kurt described the show in a letter to Toby and indescribably fucked up on booze and drugs and out of tune and rather sloppy. It took me over 15 minutes to change my guitar string while people heckled me and called me drunk. After the show, I ran outside and vomited. At the club, Kurt noticed Iggy Pop in the audience, and this time Kurt wasn't wearing an embarrassing shirt. It was probably the most flattering moment of my life, he observed. Yet the most revealing part of Kurt's letter of admission and increasing drug abuse, including Quaaludes, which he had been ingesting like candy. I've been taking a lot of drugs lately, he wrote Toby. It might be the time for the Betty Ford Clinic or the Richard Nixon Library to save me from abusing my anemic rodent-like body any longer. I can't wait to come back home, wherever that is. In a bed, neurotic, malnourished, and complaining of how the weather sucks, and it's the whole reason for my misery. I miss you, Bikini Kill. I totally love you, he signed, Kurt. This letter, like so many others he wrote, went unsent, or perhaps to a woman that he had ran into 2 weeks before the Jabberjaw show. She would play a far larger role in his life than the Betty Ford Clinic and the Richard Nixon Library, or Toby Vale. He remembered her for her small part from Straight to Hell. And now we've made it officially to the pictures of the book. I'm going to attempt on this part in the video too to at least have all the pictures that are in the video, in the book here, in the video. Kurt Cobain at 2 months, old with Father Don. Don is wearing his service station uniform with his name above his breast. It's crazy. My father did the same job in the 1980s. Wendy, Kim, and Don Cobain, Christmas of 1974. And on the other page, we got Kurt's first grade photo and Kurt's fifth grade photo of 1979. Courtesy of Leland Cobain. All these family photos are courtesy of Leland. Kind of wonder why he has them. Why it went to come from Don. Kurt in his room in his house on 1210 East 1st Avenue in Aberdeen, 1985. Courtesy of Courtney Love. On the other page, I got Dave Foster and Kurt Novoselic outside the Vogue for the first show in Seattle. Someone where Dave Foster with the redneck mustaches. Got Kurt sitting on his lap and holding the beer. And 2 pictures in one of those places that you take a photo booth set of photos with Tracy Mandar and Kurt. Woolworth's photo booth portrait 1988. Kurt was going through a phase of wearing scarves on his head. Kurt in the kitchen of his Olympia apartment. He covered with cabinets with clippings from magazines. On the next page is Kurt in his pajamas in 1988. Kurt, Chad Channing, Jason Everman, Chris Novoselic in the March of 1989. The Seattle waterfront. Below that, they're in the van. Chad Channing, Chris Novoselic, Kurt and his half-sister Brianne in their Nirvana van. Photo courtesy of Tracy Mandar. The top photos courtesy of Alice Wheeler. Kurt in the backyard of his house in Olympia on the next page, summer of 1989. Photo courtesy of Tracy Mandar. Martyr, however you pronounce her name. I can't never remember how to pronounce it right. Next page, it's got Kurt and his sister Kim and their Aunt Marie. Christmas of 1989. Photo of Marie Earl, so it came from his Aunt Marie. Below that, it's got Jesus, believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved. Kurt in front of a sign in Olympia. Photo Tracy Mandar. That's so funny. Nirvana live at the Motorsports Speedway in Seattle, Washington. That was a hell of a good show. It was always fun one to watch. Courtney Love and Dave Grohl, Kurt on the beach in Waikiki. So they're on the front of a cliff getting married. February 24th, 1992, moments after Kurt and Courtney were married. Francis, Kurt and Courtney, Christmas 1992. Photo of courtesy of Jackie Ferry, courtesy of Courtney Love. Photos courtesy of Courtney Love. Kurt arriving back at the SeaTac airport after his home suicide attempt, one of his last known photographs of him. Photo by Dwayne DeWitt. Kurt sporting his red sunglasses and a definite Elmer Fudd looking hat. Francis and Kurt and Annie Michael Kelly DeWitt at the SeaTac airport in 1994. Sure, he's pissed because Callie's in the picture. It's gotta suck so fucking bad. And somebody runs your daughter like that. And they want you to be fucking sober and fucking clean. The greenhouse at Lake Washington home, 1994, April. Photo Alice Wheeler. And the very last picture, this is of Kurt and Francis. So I'm going to do my best to get all these pictures for you guys on screen. So those are the people that can see with their eyes. And that's the end of chapter 13 and the pictures. So this one was extra special and long. Because it was April 1st, April Fools. We're going to continue up and try to finish this book by Kurt's anniversary, coming up soon. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.